Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to another installment of A Date with Darkness podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Jones, and thank you so much for joining in with me today on today's episode. And of course, as you know, I like to tell it, I have another great episode planned for you today. But before we get into the episode, I want to do a bit of housekeeping as always. Please note that if you have any questions, comments, or concerns with me, datewithdarkness@gmail.com is the email where you can reach me. If you want to sign up for my newsletter and receive little tidbits of information on a weekly basis about narcissism and narcissistic abuse, go to drnataliejones.com. And you can also download the free ebook where it says, how to find out if you are a toxic person. And you could do that as you sign up for my email newsletter. That's a free book there. And also, for folks who have been asking, I am doing individual and group membership coaching as been requested by me for a few years now. And I finally decided to open up the doors for that. So click in the show notes, the link in the show notes on whatever podcast app that you use, and you could sign up for that there also down in the group membership signups and be notified when that opens up. So today's guest, I have a lovely guest on that is going to be exploring intimate relationships with me. She is, I like to call her an Instagram buddy, Eliza Boquin on Instagram. And she and I have a lot to talk about in today's session. So be sure to take off your shoes and relax for this one, because I think she drops a lot of gems in this episode. Hi, and welcome to the show, Eliza. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me here.
I'm excited to have you on. It's always nice to meet an Instagram connection, Facebook connection virtually, and have people on the show to talk about topics that we're both passionate about. I was wondering if you could tell my listeners a little bit about you, who you are, and what drives the passion behind your work.
Love it. Yes. So I am Eliza Boquin. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, psychotherapist in Houston, Texas. My private practice is the Flow and Ease Healing Center. And a lot of the work that I do there is either working individually with people who are struggling with relationships they're struggling to have really healthy, I like to say, pleasure-filled, mutually satisfying relationships. And that may be because of past trauma, or it may be because of shaming messages they received around sex. So I work with them individually, or I'll work with couples. And I'm also an entrepreneur. Like I said, I have Flow and Ease Healing Center. I'm also the co-founder of Melanin and Mental Health, which is we look to bridge the gap between Black Latinx communities and also the mental health field. So, and I'm also a podcaster, right? So Between Sessions podcast, that's something that we have through Melanin Mental Health.
Nice.
And then my own podcast is Chakra, Sex, and Relationships, because another area of my expertise is I am a certified energy healer. And so that's some of the work that I incorporate into the work that I do. So relationship therapist, sex therapist, energy healer, entrepreneur. What drives me, I would say, is really understanding what it's like to live with shame, right? To live with shame, because I am Latina, and my
Mm,
parents raised us Catholic. So shame was kind of how you kept keep your children in check. And so I know what it's like to live with shame and how it can limit us. And I just look to help liberate people from that so that we can have
mm,
more lives that are really true to ourselves, and that we're centered, and that we can enjoy life, right? That it doesn't have to be always just a struggle or
mm.
suffering, but that there can be all kinds of pleasure that we can experience. And shame is one of those blocks to it. And so I love being able to help people relieve themselves of
That's
shame.
amazing. I like that. Thank you so much for that. And I do think that that's all too common, that shame-based experience. And with that being said, what's the number one source of shame that you see in between couples or the people that you work with? If you had to identify like those top tier shame-based beliefs that people carry, what would you say that was?
I'd say two different, of course, sexual shame, because as a sex therapist, that's a lot of times that's what people are coming to work on. So I would say sexual shame, and I would say the shame of not living up to expectations
Mm,
that they believe they should be living up to.
mm,
So I'm not fitting this role, or I'm not fitting this expectation. And I feel a lot of shame. I feel like something's fundamentally at the core wrong with me as a
mhm.
result of it.
What does that look like in real life?
What does that look like in real life?
Yeah.
Well, the sexual shame, I would say, of course, is it's going to keep people from either being able to have a closeness, a sexual intimacy, or being able to enjoy
Mm,
sexual pleasure, right? Because they've got all this stuff. Or it may be that whatever they enjoy sexually, or their ability to be sexual, is something that they can't do with a partner that they feel emotionally close to. So there may be secrecy, there may be
mm,
them meeting certain sexual needs but feeling that they can't be open about it within the relationship. Shame about not living up to expectations, that can look like us checking out of the relationship. Well,
mm,
why bother? Why make this effort? It can look like taking a one down position with our partners, to where we start to really get down on ourselves and maybe tolerate more than we really should be tolerating in a relationship, because we feel bad about ourselves. Or the opposite, we have this shame and we build ourselves up really, really, really big, and try to take a one up position on our partners. And
mm.
so it just creates imbalance. I think that's the biggest thing, is it creates imbalance in our lives.
Absolutely. I appreciate you breaking it down for us like that. One of the questions that I have, as I work a lot with people who are spouses of or are in relationships with narcissists.
Mhm,
Part of how that sort of manifests is in the sexual relationships,
mhm,
right? And sometimes what people think is, if me and that person, even if we're not on the same level, even if we're not connecting emotionally, even if we don't even like each other, I should be obligated to have sex with this person. I should do it anyway.
yeah, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that, and perhaps maybe the healthier way to approach that?
Mhm. Yeah, I see that a lot, in particular with heterosexual couples,
Yes.
right? And I will see it a lot with cisgendered women, right? And I think a big part of that is because of both how cisgendered men and women are socialized,
Mm,
and the role that sex plays in relationships, or that we're told is plays in the relationship, or should play in the relationship. And it is often very transactional, right? Like, so if you do this, then I'll do this. Or if you do this, then of course I need to do this. And very little conversation, I think, in particular for women, because growing up as girls, we're not necessarily told or instructed that sex is something for our enjoyment,
Mm,
right? Like it's because you're going to procreate. It's because this is what a good, partner does, a good wife does. It's because you don't want your partner to have a wandering eye, but very, very little conversation around you do this because it's fun and it's enjoyable and it's a closeness that you can experience with your partner and that you get to enjoy it just as much as your partner. So I think that's part of where that obligation comes in. And then men are kind of socialized to expect that of women, of their women partners, right? So again, it's these expectations that are placed and nobody really challenges them. Nobody really challenges them because we just kind of do what we're told makes a good relationship. I think a different approach to
yeah.
it in where it's going to be more balanced, because again, the root of how I approach healing is very much rooted in the way that indigenous folks would approach healing, and that is that anything can be medicine and anything can be poison,
Mm,
and that it is more about balance. Nothing is neither good nor bad. Is it out of balance?
okay.
So what I like to think about is if we are going to have more of an enjoyable sex life to where I enjoy it also, I think that starts with me being able to, what we talked about before, not have shame around what brings me pleasure, what do I want to explore, what feels good to me, and knowing that I have a right to experience pleasure as well, and that we are both invested and as equally excited about each of us getting those needs met in the relationship.
That's great advice. Is there a way or something that you recommend? It's kind of difficult with the types of folks that I work with, but is there a way that you sort of recommend getting in sync or getting in connection with or getting back on the same level, at least to where the two of you are trying to speak the same language before attempting intimacy?
Well, I do think kind of what to speak to what you're saying,
Mm,
is that it has to feel safe. And I
yes.
know that what you're talking about and the population that you work with and the folks that you work with, when you're dealing with someone who it is all about them,
Yes.
right? That doesn't feel safe to do. And so what is really great sex allows us to get really, really vulnerable. And what is necessary for us to get really, really vulnerable is that it has to be safe and that I have to trust you. Right. And so I think if we don't have that, that's a really difficult ask of somebody. But if you do have that, if you do have that safety, then I think first and foremost, like the term that comes to mind is know thyself.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that's because sometimes we have this expectation, that our partners should know, will know, and if they love us, they will know. I shouldn't have to ask you. I shouldn't have to tell you. You should figure it out about what we want to explore, what feels good to us, and a lot of times we don't even understand that for ourselves.
Mm,
I really think there is an awareness that we have to have, and even an exploration of how we view sexuality and what role it plays in our lives, and being able to see it as something that I am a sexual being. I was born with sexual parts that respond to touch, that feel pleasure, and that's okay. And this is actually an extension of my health. And how do I nurture it and protect it, and embrace it?
mm. And I think that's a good piece right there because there's a lot of people out there listening to this that were conditioned to be pleasers as
Yes.
opposed to like, you know, being into myself and knowing how to please myself. I'm more into pleasing somebody else.
Yeah. I think that's twofold.
Yes.
Okay. Because I do think that there is a lot of pleasure that we can take in, bringing pleasure to our partners. And I'm talking
Yes.
about sex. I'm talking outside of that
Yes.
also. So I do think in particular, like with sex, there's a lot of pleasure that we can experience by bringing pleasure to our partners, right? What I would say is how to make sure that you are regularly tapping in to whether this is in balance
Mm,
is that to be a good partner, we have to be able to, again, look at this as balance, to be able to give and to receive. So part of being a good partner is the ability to receive, right?
mhm,
And if we think of this, again, energetically, like what I was saying earlier, is our ability to experience really great sex is also synonymous with our ability to be vulnerable,
mm,
which is our ability to be open
mm,
and to be receive. Just the act of receiving is an open act, right? Like I am opening myself up to receive. Now, what this might look like in your body is that if I have a difficult time receiving, if I am more comfortable in always giving, I might tense up during sex. I might feel more inhibited during sex. And that's different. That is different than I like to bring pleasure to my partner because I can still be open and flowing and experiencing pleasure, but not be tense up. And the focus just has to be on you.
very
Does
good.
that make
That
sense?
makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I want to back up for a second because there's also the piece that you mentioned about being vulnerable. And I think a lot of people have trouble with that. There are people that enter relationships with a wall up, so to speak, and that wall can manifest itself in different ways. Can you talk a little bit about vulnerability,
Yeah.
what it
Yeah.
is, and how we can obtain it?
Yeah. Well, vulnerability again is if we are going to have intimacy, physical, sexual, emotional intimacy, then we have to be able to experience vulnerability, that openness. So I always like to say, intimacy, into me you see, right? That
Mm,
means I bring down my guard,
wow, I like
right?
that.
Yeah, I got that from somebody else, so I
Yeah.
can't say it. But we bring down that guard, that we bring down that wall, right? So I think the piece that has to be married to vulnerability is our ability to discern
Mm,
who is who has earned my vulnerability, because the vulnerability is I am opening myself up, you get to know me more, I get to know you more, you see me not just at my best but also at my worst.
yes.
But that is something that people earn, and depending on our history, I may just struggle and just kind of be open to everyone or not be able to see the warning signs when
Mm,
someone when or see the warning signs but talk myself out of those warning
yes.
signs. Or I may be on the other end where I'm too rigid and nobody's going to hurt me. Nobody's going to have access to me because there is a risk in being vulnerable.
Mm,
But if you're going to have a connection that goes beyond the surface, that vulnerability, that openness is required. But again, discernment, who's really earned um, that openness from you. And not everybody does deserve
yeah.
that.
Yeah, and I think people forget about that piece sometimes, or sometimes it's misrepresented or misunderstood in terms of the earning potential from somebody, and
Yeah.
they go from earning potential to we feel good together, or this person gave me a very good feeling, or it was very easy to talk to this person in the very beginning.
Well, and I think there's a lot going on with that. And again, maybe some of the folks that you work with,
Yeah.
you're gonna find those folks that they know what to say, they know what to do, they will charm the pants off of you,
Yes.
right? And so I do think we have to give ourselves some grace also, because sometimes we just don't always we'll have mishaps. We have maybe don't see the signs, because there are people that are very skilled at
Yes.
presenting themselves a certain way. So I would say that. But what I would say is that the warning signs or what we're talking ourselves off to is really rooted in boundaries. And I love what you said. You said sometimes we feel,
Yes.
right? So many of us like, and I hear this a lot. I think I just had one of my sessions earlier today. It's like we base so much on what we do in a relationship because this feels a certain
Mm,
way, right? And feelings aren't facts.
mm. Preach to us now.
Feelings are not facts. Feelings are not facts, and feelings are, they come and they go. And
Mm,
so having boundaries also when feelings are not getting in the way and they're not impacting my decision making is also important. So lots of moving parts. There's a lot of moving parts to this, I believe.
there is, and I'm glad
Yeah.
you broke it down for us so eloquently in that way, because I think it's good for people to kind of really truly understand what it takes, and understand that feelings are not facts, as you said, but that people need to earn. It's kind of like that old fashioned way. And I think that's important now more so than ever, because we're in the generation of clicking a button and getting what we want right now.
Yes. 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 And I do think it's difficult because a lot of the times, okay, so what we were talking about earlier, at the beginning of a relationship, it is supposed to be exciting and fun. And, we got
Mm,
all of these chemicals that are raging through our body. And this is just Mother Nature's way of getting us together with people and
mhm.
trying to keep the human race to continue, right? Like that's part of what's happening, right? Is that survival instinct within us. So
Yes.
you've got like this chemistry stuff going on, and then anything that is new and fun and exciting, that is also intoxicating, right?
Mm,
So you got all of that stuff that is going on as well. And so I think you add to that that people do want to have these relationships that you see on your social media feed that looks perfect, and people
yes.
are coordinated outfits on the yacht, and everybody's an entrepreneur, and everybody is building an empire, right? And so we're all trying to mimic that. And I do think that it's important that part of that long lasting connection and intimacy comes with time.
Mm,
It comes with getting to know people. It is built when you face challenges together, right? Like
yes.
that deep stuff, it doesn't come from the surface stuff. It doesn't come from the yacht trips together.
It doesn't. It doesn't. And then also too, energy can change, and I kind of want to get into it with you about energy too, because I know that's your other jam, because
Yeah.
I do feel like people's energies can change. And, again, this could be a very heteronormative conversation, but in terms of people just sticking it out when energy changes and it drops off or it's non-existent anymore, and we're just kind of hoping and waiting for it to get back to the way it was in the beginning, when it was all lovely roses and beautiful music and things like that. So I want to kind of get into the energy aspect of it too with you.
I do think that things shift, right? And I think when
Yes.
things shift, I mean, they do shift. There's
Sure.
different phases. And I think when things begin to shift, where maybe it's not this like pulsating energy that you feel at the
Yes.
beginning, and it's more like this steadiness,
Yes.
that people can mistake that as something is wrong. We lost that spark. We lost that energy. And I think a lot of the times people just anticipate it to just be there versus understanding a lot of the reason why that energy was there at the beginning of your relationship is because you were cultivating it. You were saying, hey, I'm going to pick you up at this time and we're going to go. And, I'm asking you questions and we're building, these different experiences
Yes.
together. It didn't just happen, and yet, and so we want more of that. We want more of that. And so we
Yes.
get in these committed relationships, which it does get boring. Like, let's just be real. And what I mean by boring is that, like, it becomes repetitive, it becomes safe. I know what you look like in the morning, right? And so that's just part of being with someone when you're in with someone for a committed amount of time, for a long-term time, for in a committed relationship.
Yes.
And so here we have to continue
Mm.
cultivating that energy, cultivating the opportunities to experience that. And I think we miss that.
I would agree. And I would also say that anything in the beginning that's very high energy and that's kind of, it's all wonderful. It's great. It's beautiful. And not to say that your relationship can't have elements, but 24/7, 100% of the time, it's not sustainable. It's not realistic over a long period of time.
Yeah. And it's natural for it to I tell that to clients all the time. I'm like, there's a point where, like, your body's not going to do that anymore, and that's just nature's way of getting you to go out and go to work. Right? Like, if I felt like this all the time, I don't want to get out of bed. Let's just stay here
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah.
So we kind of have to go back to meeting our responsibilities, and we can't stay in that high
Yes.
all the time. But I do think that people panic when they don't feel that. And I also think that so much has changed within even the last 100 years about what people need from a relationship. So, where before these committed relationships in marriage, what was really at the root of a lot of it was financial reasons,
Mm,
socioeconomic reasons. And as we have evolved and things have changed, it's only within the last few decades, I would say, that we are now marrying people or we're getting with people because we want this higher tier needs met, which are our emotions, which is I want to evolve and I want to grow with you. It's not just rooted in survival. And so I
mm,
think that has changed the game also. And yet we're still trying to have these relationships on this prototype of when we were in survival mode.
mm. Wow. Yeah. So that's something that, I haven't really thought about in terms of, how just over time we're changing, and would you say that that's the same across the board? Or would you again say that that's again very heteronormative in terms of women are seeking out men who are providers and so forth?
I think it's across the board. I really think it's across the board because also as same-sex couples have been able to now be married, and there's still a lot of work for us to be able to do to be able to give them the same access to the rights that come with heterosexual couples as far as marriage goes and all of that. But I do think that having the ability to expect more of our partners,
Yeah.
we expect more of our partners,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. We want more. And so a lot of times what will happen is then we look to our parents or our grandparents for advice, or they're giving us unsolicited advice, and they're like, well, what's wrong? Like, they'll either say that doesn't exist, or yeah, this is just kind of what happens. And so we're kind of, I think, in this phase where we're redefining relationships and what we want from them and what we anticipate from them. And anytime that you're kind of starting things from new, it's
Yeah.
hard. It's hard.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing too, that everything that any sort of expectation you have, relationship or otherwise, is going to have work, right from the very beginning. But I also think there's a part of um, honoring
Mm,
yourself in terms of what you want and what you need from somebody, and being realistic. So it's kind of like a fine line sort of finesse, being realistic, honoring yourself in doing what it's going to take, or having the necessary elements of what it's going to take to make your relationship thrive in today's society.
yeah. that honoring yourself, one thing that I often recommend to people is that they get really clear on what their core values are,
Yes. Yes.
right? Like you need to know what is most important to you
Yes.
and be able to name it. Because it's when we compromise our core values, it's when we negotiate our core values that we suffer. And so the more clear I am on what is important to me, what are my non-negotiables, then that can serve as the anchor as I am looking for a relationship, as I'm
Mhm.
even outside of relationships, friendships,
Yeah.
work, what have you. But I have to understand that, and I have to be honest with myself and know that if I negotiate this, I'm probably not going to be satisfied, right? Like my overall satisfaction is gonna be low.
Absolutely. And I feel like this is almost like a daily conversation I have with a lot of my clients. What are your
Mhm.
core values? And it's
Mhm.
good. I'm glad that you brought that up because I think that's a conversation that warrants us diving deeper into. Because I too agree with you that core values are something that should be set prior to friendships, prior to romantic relationships. It's basically how you should rate people or how you should assess people that are kind of worthy of coming into your inner circle, right?
Mhm.
And not vice versa. I feel like a lot of the folks that I work with, they have these values, but then they meet somebody and that
Yeah.
person looks good on the outside, or that person is saying the right things, but their values aren't quite matching up with ours. So maybe we can kind of wiggle it to make it work for that individual. And then that's when all hell breaks
Yeah.
loose.
Yep, that's that negotiating them, right? Like, okay, well, maybe you'll come around. Maybe that, with time. And I always tell people, okay, ask yourself if this is as good as it gets,
Yes.
right? Like, if this is as good as it gets, will that be enough? Because
Mm,
I think we get in a lot of trouble when we date for potential.
yes.
Or we're looking into, okay, they have the potential to be that, or I see glimpses of it here and there, and we hold on to
Yes.
that little glimpse. And so so much of this work is self-awareness, self-awareness, and what you said, honoring that, right? And honoring ourselves, sometimes that requires us to make some really tough decisions.
Absolutely. For
Mhm.
people that are listening and they're not quite sure what core values are, can you talk a little bit about what those are and what they look like in real day-to-day life in terms of what maybe like some examples of what core values would be?
Yes, yes. So core values, again, it is at the core what you value the most in
Mm-hmm.
life, right? So my core values I can share with you are spirituality, love, and freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So what's that look like? Well, I know that, for example, the work that I do, it has to be able to support those core values. The friendships, the relationship that I'm in, like all of that has to be supported. So, for example, if spirituality is as important to me as it is, and then I find myself in a space where that is not at all encouraged, that is not at all allowed, and I tell myself, well, but the pay is really good.
Yes.
The pay is really good, and I'll
Benefits
be
or
able to
whatever.
overlook
Yeah.
that. I'm gonna find out pretty quick that it can't be that overlooked and it not take a toll on me.
Mm.
So it really helps to not only serve as an anchor because what it can also do is I know that when I'm off, right? Like for example, my father passed away earlier, a few months ago, and I felt off there for a while. Well, of course, I'm still grieving, but like I really felt off. And I had to look back and I thought, okay, I'm not doing the spiritual practices that I know I need to feel grounded. Right.
Yeah.
So they can help to serve as also this anchor for you. Like I feel off. Well, if spirituality is my top core value, what am I doing to feed that core value?
Mm-hmm.
How is that core value showing up in my life? And it wasn't. So I know, okay, let me get back to my daily morning meditation. Let me get back to this. So it is so important for us to know because it's almost like this is what fuels me, this is my anchor, and this is what I can come back to.
Absolutely. And I like that. I would like to take a look at what that looks like in couples or in relationships when your core values are not in alignment. What does that look like? Because I'm quite sure you see that with the couples that you work with. And, as well as not just only when they're out of alignment, but what are some of the defenses that we come up with to try to make it work?
Well, I think some of the defenses are that it becomes a power struggle.
Mm,
And we may even take this position of one-upping, like this, I might feel a little morally superior, in this
mm,
way. I think what it looks like when our core values don't align
mm,
is a lot of frustration,
mm.
a lot of frustration, a lot of gridlock, right? Because at the core of who you are and at the core of who I am, they don't have to be the same core values, but they have to complement one another.
Yes, or support each and support, I
Yes,
think. Yeah.
yes. And so I think when there is not space for that, it's just like anything else, it's gonna cause suffering, right? I'm gonna feel frustrated, I'm gonna feel stuck. Maybe I'm compromising my core value because it's not a core value of you.
Yes.
So again, I'll go back to the spirituality. Maybe spirituality plays a big role in my life, and you're just like, that's not even important. And I want to practice it together, or me practicing it triggers you, and so I start to have to withhold in that part of me, so it can cause a lot of disconnect. I think that's the biggest thing, and it can cause conflict and frustration.
What's your recommendation if those core values are not in alignment and neither one of you want to compromise?
That's really tough, right? Like, that's really tough because I don't want to compromise, you don't want to compromise. So what do we do with this? Where do we go from here? Because we're stuck here.
Yes.
So we have to make a decision. Do I stay in it and I continue this frustration? Do we continue this frustration? Or do we decide, are there, maybe I won't fully see it, the value in it that you do, but can we find commonalities within that? Can
Mm,
you give me the space to be able to practice these core values, or find a way that these core values are supported? Or are you just going to serve as a block?
yeah.
And if we're at the point where like, no, we're just going to block one another, then it's kind of like, what are we doing here? Right? Like, what,
Mm,
what are we doing then? Right? Like, if we both recognize we're not budging, then we're deciding to stay in this place of distress. And
yeah.
is that really what you want?
I would agree. I would agree with that. And I think it's time to, you got to take time out to kind of really evaluate the situation because I feel like part of the friction or a large part of friction is already due to the misalignment. How much more time do you want to dedicate to being misaligned or being out of balance?
Yeah, and I think that this can happen a lot of the times when people get together and they're very young. Right?
Mm,
So, like, if you have been with somebody for a really long time, but maybe you got together in your 20s or even in your teens,
mm.
because our brain's not even done forming until like we're in our whatever, like, what is it, like 23 or 24,
24,
right?
25, yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So our brains are not even done forming. So there can be like this major shift and change in who I am. And we can either grow together, right? Like, that's ideal. We grow together in the same direction, maybe at different speeds, but never too far apart. Or what often happens, and I see this happen a lot with those relationships that they've been together since they were really, really young, is one person wants to grow in this direction, and this person's like, hey, you're disrupting a good thing here. Come back.
Yeah.
And or this person's like, you're not, come on, like, you're not catching up. So they hold themselves back. This is the perfect breeding ground for resentment and frustration and disconnect. or people grow apart,
Mm,
right? People grow apart. And so I think the goal of the relationship is, how do we have this space between us that is our relationship, where both of us can evolve and be supported within that relationship? Can we do that?
yeah,
And if we can't, then if we're not growing, we're staying where we're at,
yeah.
or we're growing apart.
Mm, I totally agree. You had written a quote on Instagram. You said something to the effect that people want to be loved and not be fixed.
Yes.
Can you say more about that? Because I do feel like that's also something that I see quite a bit in my practice. You had spoken about the potential, right? The potential. And so a lot of times when we base things on potential, we put our hard work and energy in it. And I like to call it, I work with heterosexual and a lot of women that I work with, or heterosexual men that I work with. So I like to call it build a man or build a woman type
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
store, that kind of thing. And I'm just wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, and I get that, because I think, we're therapists, so I'll speak for myself at some point, like I used to say, I love a man that is troubled, right? Like
Yes.
I was that girl in
Fixer
school
upper.
that, right. I was the girl in school that was like, oh, like the bad boy, and I wonder what's hurting him, So, like, okay, the thing is, the thing is, what we know is change is really, really hard. Change is really hard. And in order for change to be long lasting,
Yeah.
we have to want that change.
Yeah.
So that's one part. But I think when we when we date somebody and we're like, I'll just kind of love you this much, and I'll show you this type of love that nobody's ever shown you, and I'm going to help heal you. I'm going to help, you meet your potential. Essentially, what we're saying is, what you got going on right now is not good enough, but stick with me and I'll get you there. So automatically, I'm taking a one up position.
Yeah.
That's contempt.
Mm.
That's contempt, right? Like, okay,
Mm.
I'll help you out, right? And so that's always problematic. If we take a one up position with our partner, or we take a one down position with our partner, that's always muddy water. And so it's not our job to fix people. We can grow together. That's not to say that you can't meet somebody
Sure.
and be like, I got, I'm 45, a therapist, and I still have stuff to work on, and I'm in therapy, been in therapy.
Yeah.
But is that person actively working on their stuff?
Yeah.
Am I actively working on mine? I think that's really the key. But our job is not to fix people. And spoiler alert, we can't. Even if you try, you're going to find
Yeah.
yourself exhausted and depleted, because you can't change anybody but yourself.
Absolutely. And do you feel like, one of the things that I've thought about, people who consistently do that, rescuers or whatever you want to call them, do you feel like they're kind of taking on these sort of one-upsmanship projects because they're avoiding their own stuff, or what do you think is going on there?
Oh yeah, we're definitely, that could certainly be an issue. We're avoiding our own stuff if we are in that position where we think we can fix somebody, right? Like, clearly, I'm not looking at my stuff, because that's what part of what's happening here. So a lot of times it is easier to focus on other people's stuff and try to help them than it is for us to take a look in the mirror, instead of saying, you know, what is it about me that I need to find somebody that is struggling? Why is that? Is
Yeah.
it because I think, is that a worthiness issue? Is that because it's safer?
Yeah.
Is it safer for me to be with somebody who I think they haven't met their fullest potential? So it really becomes a question of, why am I drawn? Why am I drawn? Not why are people that need fixing drawn to me? Why am
Oh
I
yeah.
drawn to people that deem I deem as needing fixing? Because that's the other part. Because I'm deciding you could be better if you just did these things, right? They're just happy. You know, they're happy where they're at, but you're letting them
Yeah.
know, you know, this is where you really need to be. That also, there's a certain level of judgment and again, moral superiority that comes with that.
Yes, very much so. And I think people forget about that piece, right? They just kind of see it as like, oh, I want them to be better or do better. But it's also too, I wonder, part of it is like, you know, taking in a bird with a broken wing syndrome. We kind of take on these people projects or things that we deem as people projects because we know to a certain extent they're not going to leave us.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and because sometimes also I would say is that we think that maybe somebody with those qualities already wouldn't be interested in us.
Mm.
So it's kind of like that build a person. Well, I'll give me all of the parts and I'll get them there versus
Yeah.
already going to the store and getting that all put together because I can't afford that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I really like that. Almost kind of like buying a lemon car. Like I can't, I'll work on that car, but I can't take the brand new Mercedes just yet.
Yes, yes, not that humans are Mercedes or
Very
lemons, but
true,
it
very
is
true.
yes,
I
yeah,
agree, but you got to have some humor about the situation.
exactly.
Just like, and it's always so interesting to see too. It's like it's kind of like what are you doing? When you see people, when you see family members that you love or friends that you care about or people that are kind of doing that, it's always kind of something else to kind of see them doing this or repeating this cycle over and over again.
Well,
Very good.
that's the thing is we operate in patterns, right? So what are they doing? They're repeating the pattern somewhere. That whether it's a family pattern, whether it's a pattern in their lives,
Amen.
intergenerational pattern. It's a pattern because that's what we do until we don't do that anymore.
I would totally agree with you.
Mhm.
I think this has been a lovely chat between you and I. I would love for you to tell folks, how they can find you, what you're working on, how we can support you in future endeavors.
Yes. So you can find me on social media. So my handle for my private practice is at Eliza G. Boquin, ELIZAGBOQUIN. And you can find me on Instagram, on Twitter. You can also go to flowandeasehealing.com. I
Mhm.
actually have a pleasure meditation that you can download there. If you're somebody who struggles with pleasure, who struggles with the concept of it, you can go there, download that for yourself. And then you can also visit melaninandmentalhealth.com if you're looking for a therapist that is a Black Latinx therapist and that
Mm,
specializes in issues from our communities. You can follow Melanin and Mental Health also on social media at Melanin and Mental Health. And so, yeah, connect with me. You will find me on social media. I love it.
I love
And so I would love to connect with y'all.
That's amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about the meditation?
Yeah, so the meditation is really designed to help you allow your body to help you get into that mode of what's it like to open myself up to pleasure. So there are many different forms of pleasure, and I think pleasure is one of those things that we don't always know how to cultivate in our lives. So if you download it, I think it's like maybe 7 minutes or so. It's something that you can use as a visualization. It's something that you can use as kind of a grounding practice, but it will help you to get a little bit more familiar on how to access that part of your mind and that part of your body so that you can begin to replicate that in other areas of your life.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I appreciate having you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.